And good afternoon, everyone. It is sometimes nice to just move away from the daily practice of atrocity prevention and R2P and just come in an environment where you have some of the sort of broader normative and academic discussions, which we generally don't get the time to do, to think, to reflect about what's working, what's not working, and how do we move forward. So also it's like a good opportunity to get outside the bubble of practitioners and to see what is the thought process or the current discussion within different countries and different academic spheres and forums. So I would first like to begin by thanking the organizer and also Henning in particular for bringing us all together. When you read the program, it sounds very complicated in terms of all the different formats, but I think that what he's tried to do is to make sure that we have as much discussion as possible. And in this sort of spirit, I've been asked to speak for 20 minutes, and maybe I will, but if I'll stop short, and then maybe we can have a question and answer, a discussion, rather than me just talking at you. So I was asked to focus the keynote on the question of global responsibility, just a construct. And the way I would answer this question is to say depends on the day you ask me that question. Because what is currently unfolding in Gaza, I'm really questioning whether we have even consensus on the issue that all human beings deserve a right to life and dignity. The champions, the countries that have been supporters of R2P for the longest time that I have worked on this issue, in the last 4 weeks I've seen them openly support Israel as it is killed over, now the number is over 10,000 civilians and over 4,000 children. And I deal with crises, work with survivor and victims group on a daily basis, but this sort of blatant disregard where sort of the supporters of IHL are not standing by this and are treating civilian casualties as byproduct or collateral damage is really hard to deal with and has been very personally disturbing to me. So again, as I said, that if you ask me that question today, I would say that, well, I think so. But since I started writing this keynote a few weeks ago, I also want to sort of reflect on the work that we have done for the last 2 decades. But what's happening in Gaza right now is front and center, and it's really disheartening.
Can you also say a few words on Hamas?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Absolutely.
Okay.
It is. But that's the problem, no? So like the moment you say anything about Gaza, the first thing I'm asked to say is that whether...
Let her talk first.
Yes.
Sorry.
I'm not convinced, but...
Yeah, that's your opinion, but right now the podium is mine, so let me finish the keynote, and then we can have a discussion. Yeah, let's be civilized about this.
Sure.
But those thoughts aside, and we will come back to this, in the tradition of being an interesting participant, and I know that we had a fantastic panel to sort of set the stage. All 3 panelists came from different perspectives, and it was really interesting to see a very rich and nuanced discussion on the responsibility to protect as well as the idea of humanitarian intervention. So some of the points that I'm going to be making here have already been made by the 3 speakers previously, but I will just try to bring more focus to some of those issues, and I hope that it can clarify some of the questions and set the stage for the discussion in the next 2 days. So when we say that it's a global construct, and given the premise of the discussion of the conference itself, are we questioning whether responsibility to protect is just a construct because the way we are measuring whether this responsibility has been discharged is by assessing if the world, the global or international community, has been ready to undertake humanitarian intervention or rapidly authorize the use of force? Or are we asking whether the global responsibility is a commitment to do something? Because in the last 2 decades, what we have seen is that we have seen the international community respond in different ways. we have become better at prevention, we have become better at accountability, about collecting evidence, preserving evidence, as well as in holding perpetrators responsible. Whether that has been sort of, ICC, whether you can say that, Germany has done a great job in terms of thinking about universal jurisdiction, or the different cases right now in front of the ICJ, or the different accountability and collection of evidence mechanisms. Or are we just saying that we measure political will and we measure whether we are protecting human rights around the world or preventing atrocities from the perspective of whether we are engaging in humanitarian intervention? So that is sort of, I thought, were the question that was posed to me, and that is the attempt that I'm going to make in terms of us answering them. So again, in terms of, and this is the sort of question which comes again to us particularly from academic circles, and the other sort of constituency from where this question comes from is affected communities. So from Syria to Myanmar to Ethiopia, when we talk to victims and survivor groups, they will constantly bring up use of force as a possible mechanism to alleviate suffering at that point. But oftentimes when we think about the use of intervention or the use of force, there are around 6 points that come to us as practitioners. So the first is that and many times when people demand use of force, or when there is a discussion of whether R2P is successful, or whether R2P exists, or whether R2P is not dead, is often measured in the context of whether a humanitarian intervention happened. So, but many times these sort of claims are made without really assessing what is the role of humanitarian intervention, or what is the role of use of force in this context of protecting populations. So the 6 points that I want to raise around humanitarian intervention, the first one is, just as it is hard to prove whether prevention works, it is hard to prove that an outcome would be different or fewer lives will be lost if military force was sent in. Empirically speaking, in most situations, Kenyans in Somalia or Americans in Somalia, Force Intervention Brigade in DRC, peacekeepers in Mali, what we have seen is that they become often party to the conflict, make the situation or the conflict more asymmetrical, and it ends up leading to more deaths of civilians. In most instances, we have seen that the use of force will lower the death toll in the very short term, but doesn't necessarily lead to long-term peace or preventing of atrocities in the future, or even sort of bringing down the level of escalation of hostilities. The fourth point is military and humanitarian intervention is essentially inherently biased because you are protecting a population from a perpetrator. In most cases, this perpetrator is generally the state. So humanitarian intervention in the short term, as I said, would save some lives. But for it to be successful, or for it to have impact in terms of long-term protection of civilians, there has to be more engagement. And this sort of takes me to my fifth point, where, R2P, Martin mentioned this, that we're still sort of living under the shadow of Libya. And in the context of, I was watching the UN Security Council vote as 1973 happened, and there was a vote to establish what was that? I'm sorry, I'm just completely losing the...
No-fly zone?
A no-fly zone. And at that time, when the no-fly zone was established, there was a real credible threat that Gaddafi forces would commit mass atrocities in Benghazi. And even though India, Brazil, Germany, they all abstained from the vote, they all in their statements outlined that there was a credible threat and that it was a responsibility of the Libyan government to protect its population. So in the short term, at that point of the vote, there was a credible threat and the no-fly zone was imposed to protect civilians. But sort of the lack of political will to continue to engage with Libya in a very systematic way has left populations vulnerable to multiple abuses and atrocities even today. And that has cast a shadow in how Martin talked about it, how we have reacted to Ukraine, how there's sort of this reluctance to use R2P when it is actually needed. And sort of the final point is that in the context of, again, and as I said, is it fit for purpose? So many times when people will call for use of force, I mean, even when Ukraine happened, this was an international aggression by Russia, there was a war going on, but I was getting calls from policymakers and governments who were sort of thinking in terms of, like, should we introduce a multinational UN force? Like, what happens if we impose a no-fly zone? And there were all of these ideas which were coming out, and it was very hard to sort of parse out with many of these policymakers that what is this peacekeeping force? Like, a military force to do what in this context? Are they going to become party to the conflict? Are they there to support the Ukrainian military? And I mean, if they are, then is it NATO? Then NATO becomes party to the conflict. So it was very hard to sort of parse out all of these different arguments, because people who sometimes talk about force will not parse out what the force is actually going to do what, to what end, to help whom, for how long, so those are some of the factors which always come in the context of sort of use of military force, in the context of humanitarian intervention. So those are my thoughts about sort of humanitarian intervention and in general, and the use of force in general, because I just want conference participants to think about that when we talk about R2P and when we talk about protecting civilians, do we immediately go to use of force, and what does that mean? So those are sort of the first sort of argument that I want to sort of put forth in front of you. My second argument was very much sort of, unpacked a little bit in the first panel discussion, in which, sort of Kevin talked about humanitarian intervention. We had John talk about, sort of what is the value of R2P in this context. So he brought up the R2P, and then Martin was a great sort of arbitrator of both those different conversations. So just for the sake, because I've written it in the keynote, I will just say that with so we need to parse out what are the different categories that we are talking about, because conceptual clarity in how we think about different situations is important here. So as a person who works on R2P and atrocity prevention on a daily basis, Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine, these are not countries that I think in the context of the responsibility to protect. Because Afghanistan, for example, was, and again, even in the context of humanitarian intervention, Afghanistan was not one of those humanitarian intervention. Neither the impulse to go into Afghanistan, nor the withdrawal took into account human rights nor atrocity prevention. It was totally about responding to Al-Qaeda as a response to 9/11. It was not about sort of, staying there and transforming the society. That's what happened as a byproduct of it, but then the withdrawal of it, again, thousands of Afghans were evacuated, but millions are still living there in conditions even which are worse. There is gender persecution to a level that it can be also called a gender apartheid. Iraq is, again, especially not sort of so much as Iraq 1, but the second Iraq war was very much about weapons of mass destruction. It was not really, the violations in the Abu Ghraib prison, over 1 million Iraqi dead, multiple thousands of American casualties, NATO casualties. And again, just the withdrawal from Iraq was also not sort of dependent on any conditions around human rights or atrocity prevention. So neither Iraq nor Afghanistan can be classified as humanitarian intervention. And the reason I'm bringing this is what was mentioned in the concept note in the agenda. So I just wanted to parse out these different contexts. in the context of Russia, again, in the context of Russia in Georgia, in the context of Russia in Donbass in 2014, and in the context of Russia in 2023, invading Ukraine. Again, none of these, Russia can make claims that it was, war crimes and genocide against ethnically Russian populations, but there was no evidence whatsoever. And the only way that we can refute consistently and constantly is by doing, better monitoring, better understanding of what is happening in a particular situation to refute these claims. And it's not just the Russians which have used the argument for R2P. It was also, the United Kingdom, Tony Blair, when NATO and the US were going into Iraq, R2P was used as an example to go in there. So misuse of a norm happens all the time. Governments instrumentalize these norms to for certain objectives. So that's always the case. It happens with women, peace and security. It happens with children in armed conflict. It happens with IHL even. So it's not just R2P which is misused. I think norms are consistently and always operationalized, and the role of academics and civil society participants is always to sort of think in terms of how can we refute these claims by providing credible evidence. So that's sort of the, I just wanted to lay it out. But in the context of sort of humanitarian interventions, Kevin spoke about this, I would say that Somalia in 1994 could be an example of humanitarian intervention where sort of you saw these images of, Somalis going through a famine, and it was sort of a, Second World War and the end of the, not the Second World War, the end of the Cold War, and the dividends from the end of the Cold War, the peace dividends, and we just thought that anything would be possible, and then Americans went into Somalia, became party to the conflict, and again, in the short term, yes, there was some relief, humanitarian aid was delivered, but in the long term, they became party to the conflict and then had to withdraw under very bad circumstances. And that sort of also jeopardized the international response to Rwanda at some extent, because again, there was a lot of hesitancy to go into any country. And then sort of this also played out in Srebrenica in a very particular way. So all of these, so humanitarian intervention has always had this problem of sort of not being able to parse out how it's going to enter, but also how it is going to exit. In the context of and the other sort of problem with humanitarian intervention has also been sort of within the Western narrative to sort of exclude some of the example of humanitarian interventions which were actually successful. So I would say the example that Kevin brought up, like India and East Pakistan. At that point, they didn't really have the parlance of humanitarian intervention. It was about 2 million refugees, and again, it was also for India about the fact that they had to then fight wars on two different fronts. One was West Pakistan, East Pakistan. So they went in. But it was very much about sort of India's involvement with East Pakistan and the formation of Bangladesh led to sort of creation of Bangladesh in a stable society. Tanzania and Uganda, one can also say, not in the context of ECOWAS, but Nigeria and Liberia, again, ECOWAS in Sierra Leone. So all of these sort of interventions were successful, but they're not sort of discussed in the same way that we discuss humanitarian intervention within the Western canon. And I think that that's sort of a loss of opportunity in terms of bringing in good examples where regional engagement, long-term engagement, and humanitarian intervention led to sort of bringing about political stability in that context. So that has remained sort of a bit of a problem with humanitarian intervention, where sometimes when you look at it, given the examples that we constantly harp on, become more about sort of the white man's burden rather than sort of the right of certain populations to protection or to safety or safety from atrocity crimes and human rights violations. So those are sort of the things that I wanted to lay out, that one is sort of Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine, the other is the humanitarian intervention, and then we come to R2P. And none of you will be surprised that I'm an absolute cheerleader of the norm. I work on it day in, day out. And the thing with R2P, what it has done is, and here I would sort of try to say that it has not just remained a global construct. It has not just remained a norm which is discussed within academic circles and in colleges, that it has had an impact in how we protect, how we view protection, how we think about protection of different populations from the 4 crimes. So again, R2P is very narrow, and I just really want to emphasize this. It's about protection from the 4 crimes of war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and genocide. It's not about mass migration. It's not about like a lot of other things. So in the context of R2P, what has R2P done which is very different, and where I would say that it has not just remained a global construct, but has also influenced the action of states. And in many cases, this has not led to sort of waving the flag of R2P, but in the context of Central African Republic, Mali, yes, the situation right now is not really great, and we are seeing a withdrawal of the UN peacekeeping operation. There was a consciousness about protecting populations from mass atrocity crimes, which led to a creation of a peacekeeping operation, which had a very robust POC element in it. And what R2P has also done, and which humanitarian intervention and sort of the other sort of interventions, or for lack of a better word, the other kind of sort of interferences into sovereign affairs of a state, was that it was actually adopted by 150 countries at the World Summit. In most resolutions around R2P have 2/3, majority of member states agreeing to it. But is it something which is a norm which has led to a broad-based consensus? No, and it will never be. If R2P tomorrow has consensus from all 193 countries, I will be very worried, because I'll be very happy, because either we are in a place where the world agrees that there should not be 4 crimes committed, and if they are, then we need to react to it, or that it doesn't have any teeth. Because R2P inherently is about holding perpetrators of these crimes responsible. It's not about just sort of, saying that, okay, here is your commitment to uphold your human rights obligations. It's about a context where you will clearly be biased, impartial, you will not have neutrality, because you're holding perpetrators of atrocity crimes responsible. The sometimes disingenuous claims about, R2P should not lead to regime change are also problematic, because in most cases they will, because you will not support a regime which continues to perpetrate atrocity crimes against its own population. So in no context will R2P ever be not contested. It should be contested, because it is a norm which is inherently about sort of holding perpetrators responsible. But in the context of normativeness, in the context of where the General Assembly is at, yes, there is, broad-based 2/3 of countries agree to it. Is there consensus on how we do it? How do we protect populations? What does it mean? Not really. We are still sort of unpacking a lot of what we need to do in terms of respond. Have we become better at prevention? Not really. But what R2P did, unlike humanitarian intervention, unlike a lot of the discussion in the 90s, okay, what do we do with Rwanda? What do we do with Srebrenica? It flipped the narrative in the sense that because of the pillar conceptualization of R2P, it is also about the prevention of these crimes. Prevention remains front and center, because when you start studying Rwanda, when you start studying Bosnia and Herzegovina in the context of how do we prevent atrocity crimes, it's not about April 7th or April 8th in Rwanda. It's about November of 1993, when a peacekeeping mission was deployed, when you had democracy coming up, when you had enough evidence, which Romeo Dallaire's fable talked about, that they were amassing machetes and weapons to then do something. So if R2P was really, if atrocity prevention or if prevention was really at the forefront of people's mind, we would have done something. It was not about April 7th or April 8th. When we study R2P, when we study protection of civilians, we very much study it at a point where the tools in the toolbox are very, very narrow. We study R2P in the context of, okay, only if R2P had existed, only we had consensus, and it was not just about sovereignty, we would have Marines coming down from, these helicopters and going and saving people in Rwanda. That is not sort of a useful way of thinking about it, because a useful way of thinking about what R2P has done is that it has centered prevention. And that is what is the most important part, because prevention in the end will save more lives than any kind of response could. And also the reality of it is that response is always very limited. everything being equal in a world where the Security Council was functional, where you did not have this sort of constant back and forth between Russia and America, and the P3 versus P2 versus sort of a divide in the frozen UN Security Council, everything being equal. After working in this field for over 15 to 20 years, I realized how limited is the effect of international action. Even if we use good offices, diplomacy, sanctions, arms embargoes, all the tools that we have in the toolbox, response is always going to be difficult. Response is always going to lead to, sometimes it will not stop atrocities, and sometimes even it will lead to escalation of atrocities. So it is very, very important to think in terms of prevention. It is very important to unpack what states can do, what regional organizations can do, and what the international community can do to think in terms of how we approach atrocity situations. I mean, R2P has still remained very much a boutique issue. Martin talked about this, in the case of Ukraine. If we would have utilized the atrocity prevention lens, then the US would possibly have not sent Ukraine cluster munitions. Because what cluster munitions are going to do is, it's going to, harm Ukrainian civilians for years and decades to come. I mean, we saw this with the destruction of that dam in Ukraine. There were a lot of cluster munitions, there were a lot of mines in that area. With the flooding, all the projectiles shifted, and the area which were assessed to be safe for civilians were not anymore. And this is going to keep on happening. So if we had atrocity prevention and protection of human rights at the forefront, we would not have reacted to Ukraine the way we reacted. The aid, the military aid, the humanitarian aid that is going in would have gone in from a perspective of how do we protect Ukrainian civilians? How do we make sure that there are lesser atrocities than more atrocities? Because atrocities are going to happen. They're dealing with international aggression. But there would have been more safeguards. So I would just like to say here that, again, realize when we are having these conversations around military interventions and use of force, we have to realize that A, that is complicated, but B, just the response to atrocity crimes in the context of a UN Security Council which works the way it should be working, a General Assembly, a HRC the way it should be working, is still very limited. And the final point I would like to say is that we are living in a context where atrocities are happening I think that after the 90s till around 2010, we were seeing a drop in conflicts, but then after Syria happened, we saw Russia, testing the limits of what was possible, and they committed, not that before that they hadn't committed crimes in Chechnya, but then they really tried it in Syria, then sort of seeing what the world could do, but then again in CAR with Wagner Group. So we are seeing different kinds of perpetrators coming in. We are seeing more asymmetrical conflict happening, but we are also seeing societies which are very fragmented. There's a lot of hate speech going on. There's a lot of xenophobia. There is a huge amount of sort of just vitriol within society. So take the example of Ethiopia. In that context, this is a conflict which lasted 2 years. We had over 500,000 people dead. There was really no point in this conflict, but it happened. But the solution here, again, was not to send a military force. The solution here was to really pressure Abiy into coming to the table, allowing the Tigrayans the humanitarian aid they deserve. The Ethiopian parliament has come out with an act about, a national peace mechanism, but that doesn't include the Tigrayans or the Oromiyas, the parties to the conflict they had the most sort of conflict with. But what is required in Ethiopia is a good faith act from the Ethiopian government to literally hold a peace council in every state, in every street, in every community, because that is what in the long term is going to prevent atrocities. So we just have to be, the perspective that I'm bringing here is not to say that, you should not be talking about these issues. They are very important in the context of the legality of things, in terms of norm development, in terms of understanding the limits of what the international system should be doing, should we be acting. But I think that there has to be a more nuanced understanding of how we should be acting. What are the long-term impacts of humanitarian intervention? How should we think about operationalizing R2P, just not in the context of here we are sending a force, but rather in terms of what it means to prevent, what it means to respond, what are the limits of response. Because what we are seeing now more and more is that we are spending a lot of time on accountability mechanisms. So on Syria, because we had no action in the UN Security Council, we created a IIIM. On Myanmar, again, there are a lot of different mechanisms. There is a special rapporteur, there are ways in which we are collecting evidence, but none of these mechanisms are actually alleviating any suffering of the people in Myanmar. These are about sort of international actions which are happening, which are very, very important, but they are not really making a difference in the lives of people in Myanmar, actually. So we have to really think in terms of all of these different conversations that we are happening, how we are centering civilians in this conversation, because they are the most important stakeholder. It doesn't matter which side of the conflict you are on, which side of the conflict you're not on, it's about civilian life. That is what we are all sort of, that's the biggest belief that we all believe in, and we believe in that every person has a right to life and dignity, and what should we be doing, not only in the context of these normative debates, but very carefully considering the nuance of what is prevention, what is response, and what does accountability mechanism say. So I'll stop there, but I just wanted to sort of lay out some of these factors. It's not to have it's not an either or conversation, it's a conversation about sort of holistically responding to many of the crises that we are dealing with, and at the same time recognizing very, very humbly that in the context of international response, the toolbox is very limited, and the way the conflicts are, and sort of, the fragmentation of society is happening, it's much more complicated than having sort of these blanket conversations. So I'll stop there, and I hope that that was useful to you in terms of just laying out the field a little bit.